Between last weekend and this weekend, there's a shift in the mood of the liturgy. Last weekend, the last Sunday of the church year, was the feast of Christ the King, a day when we were decked out in vestments in white and gold, and we heard of the triumph of Christ. This Sunday, the first Sunday of Advent, and Advent means coming, we're a little bit more somber, decked out in violet, and we've lit the first candle of the Advent wreath. We completed a church year last weekend. We open a new one this weekend. And whenever we finish a year and begin another year, two questions, I think, come to our minds. One is a rather pleasant one, a rather easy one, and it's this: how has God touched you this past year in all of the good things that have happened in your life? Family, friendship, success, dreams fulfilled, all those happy things. How aware have you been of God's presence in your life during the good things? Now, it's not too late to remember that God did all that stuff and was with you. Hindsight is wonderful in gratitude in that regard. But the second question is a lot more difficult. How has God touched you this past year in the tough things that have happened in your life? The disappointments, the betrayals, plans that didn't get fulfilled, breakups, loss, death, disappointment, tears. And how aware were you this past year of God's presence during those difficult times? That's tougher, even with hindsight. And yet God is with us in the good times and in the tough times. God is always with us. And I thought I would tell you a story about a gentleman whose name was Henry Viscardi, a name that you probably don't know, but the circumstances of his life I think you can resonate with. Henry was born without legs. His legs did not get fully developed, and he had stumps instead. And Henry learned to walk on those stumps. But he used to endure the ridicule of the other kids. And a lot of times he'd come home crying, hurt. And he would ask his mother, "Why did this happen to me?" And his mother used to say, "Henry, before you were born, God called a meeting of all of the heavenly council. And God said, we're going to send into the world a little boy with disability. Where shall we send him?" And he would listen, and then he would say, "I know what we're going to do. We're going to send him to the Viscardis, because there's a lot of love in that family, and they'll know how to love Henry." Well, that used to make Henry feel pretty good, because he knew that he had a place in God's plan and that God had something in mind for him to do. So Henry, early on in life, made up his mind that he was going to accomplish some things. He did well in school. As a matter of fact, he graduated from Fordham. But by this time in his life, he'd done damage to those stumps by all of the walking, to the nerves, to the bone, to the tissue. And they didn't know how to fit him with a prosthesis, with artificial legs. But he heard of a doctor in Germany who was willing to try. And that doctor was able to design some prosthetics, some artificial legs for Henry. And they worked. And Henry, for the first time in his life, could stand tall and look somebody else right square in the eyes. He wanted to pay the good doctor. The doctor said, "No. Your debt to me will be fulfilled when you do something yourself that is significant for one other person." Henry set out to do just that. World War II broke out. Henry joined the Red Cross. And Henry had a special interest in people that had lost a limb. He eventually, when the war was over, took an interest in veterans who were disabled that didn't have employment. And he founded an organization called JOB, Job. And then he continued that work with another group that he called Ability Incorporated. And Ability Incorporated eventually became the National Center for Disability Services. Henry, looking back on his life, said that God had a plan for him. There was a reason why he was born the way that he was. And it was because of that that Henry became the person that he was and was able to help other people along the way. I tell you that story about Henry because things were tough for Henry a good deal of his life. But he felt the presence of God there, and he knew that he was playing a part in God's plan. And he did that willingly. It's easy to sense the presence of God when things are going very well. It's much more difficult when things are tough. But God is always present among us. We need signs of that. We look for symbols of God's presence. And this season of the year, when the days are shorter, the nights are longer, the temperatures are colder, the ground gets frozen, and the snow is soon to come, we look for signs of hope. The Cherokee Indians had an insight about that. And this is the story that comes from them. When the world was first created, God, the great mystery, gave a gift to each species. But first, he set up a contest to determine which gift would be most useful to whom. "You will be the guardians of the forest," God said to the trees and the plants. "Even in the seeming dead of winter, your brother and sister creatures will find life protected in your branches. I want you to stay awake and keep watch over the earth for 7 nights," God told them. The young trees and plants were so excited to be entrusted with such an important job that the first night they did not find it difficult to stay awake. The second night, though, was not so easy, and just before dawn, a few of them fell asleep. On the third night, the trees and the plants whispered among themselves in the wind, trying to keep from dropping off to sleep, but it was too much work for some of them. Even more fell asleep on the fourth night.